Hello everyone, it's good to be here. Before starting, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we are meeting today. I'd like to pay my respect to the Wiradjuri leaders, past, present and emerging. I'd like, as part of this, to also acknowledge that had we as a nation been able to learn a bit more from indigenous knowledges and connect with country, really care for country, we probably would not be talking about community resilience so much in the first place. Also, for anyone who is coming from the northern rivers like me, I'd like to acknowledge that we are currently going through the first anniversary of the floods. And given also the history of disaster that have happened here, I'd like to, mention that this can be triggering. These conversations can be triggering for some people in the room, and I'd like to invite all of us to simply care for each other. In a way, kindness is a new black in these times of unprecedented disasters. And if we could just let go of our, social roles and see each other for who we are, humans navigating troublesome times, perhaps we'd be in a better place to face these together. So with this, today I'm going to be speaking about my experience and our experience of recovering from a large and unprecedented disaster, taking into example the Northern Rivers flooding events that have affected us a year ago. So I'm going to obviously spend a bit of time talking about the flooding events itself, but before this, I think it's well worth putting into context, which is already something we have been doing through the previous speakers here. So the flooding events, they didn't happen in a vacuum. As we know, though these were preceded by large-scale, unprecedented, disasters and crises of their own. We are all familiar with the bushfires that hit us, that destroyed 375 houses in Northern Rivers, burned close to 2,000 square kilometers, and also by previous floods and storms that had already affected the Northern Rivers. I mean, it is not called the Northern Rivers for a reason. But these were the capacity for the communities, businesses, council, state government to respond to those unprecedented flood was severely affected by those ongoing disasters and crises. COVID-19 had led, to the dismissal of hundreds of volunteers and staff across a number of organizations. The capacity to face yet another disaster, the energy, the mindset, the headspace that is needed was also severely affected, which means that when the floods hit, people's energy at every level was much lower than what it would have been in a normal circumstances. We also had, and we have an epidemic of loneliness in Australia, and agreeing with Mark earlier, coming together is a necessary step for us if we are to live in these times of unprecedented disasters. We need to tackle this epidemics of loneliness. And we have housing stress. This is all compounded by larger, bigger issues that we all struggle to make sense of, whether climate change and how do we raise children, what does it mean to have a successful career, and all these big questions. Also, the geopolitical tensions, whether the effects of the Ukraine war on the prices of goods, the tensions with China, the uncertainties about what's going on in our corner of the globe. Pollution, massive biodiversity loss. We truly live in times where constant speaking about return to normal doesn't make sense anymore. So the reason why I wanted to put this into perspective is because what happened with the flood is just another brick in the wall. So what makes those flooding events so unprecedented? So quoting the New South Wales Parliamentary Committee inquiry on the floodings, they recalled that in some areas, the February-March 22 floods were to a scale never seen before. So what does it look like? The Wilsons River in Lismore in particular reached a height of 14.4 meter on the 28th of February, which was the day of the first flood, which was 2 meters higher than what was the highest flood until then. A second flood also followed 5 weeks later, 4 to 5 weeks later. And that was the coffin on the nail on the coffin. Because what happened between the first and the second flood is there was a spirit of recovery that emerged very fast after the first flood. People were like, yep, okay, we got hit again, we'll be fine. Let's get back into it. Let's clean our houses. Let's remove the waste, etc., etc. And then a few weeks later, we got hit again. And that was profoundly debilitating. Because then it's not just about dealing with a single disaster. It's a bigger question about how do we live in this century of climate change? How do we make sense of that? Should we even rebuild? Should I clean my house? During both floods, and the second flood, to put things in perspective, was not an insignificant flood. It was, in the history of Lismore, the 5th largest flood. So by itself would have been devastating enough and made worse, as we'll see later, by poor warning systems. So for the 7th period ending 1st of March, the Bureau of Meteorology's Upper North Coast Rainfall District, which covers the Northern Rivers region, had its wettest week since at least 1900. That means a lot of water in the ground, preventing the soil to absorb more water. In fact, on that day, the 28th of February, 701.8 millimeter of rain was recorded at the small village of Rosebank, which is the highest daily total in the Bureau's New South Wales rain gauge network since 1954. This was mostly due to the unusually slow movement of the system above the region, which stayed put for several days in a row and pouring more water on soils which are already drenched with water. So what does it look like? Pictures say 1,000 words, as we know. I don't necessarily want to promote McDonald's, but I think this picture really speaks for itself. This picture was taken in Lismore. You can see you're familiar with those big signs. I don't know how big they are, maybe probably 10 meters high. And next to it during the floods. A plane, and on its side, there were a number of really distressing events, smaller events that shook people, even if they were not necessarily affected by water in their houses. So when you live in Australia and you live in a lucky country, and one day you get out of your house, and even though if you don't have water in your street, you walk into town and you see a cow on a house's roof. You see a container staying upright like that because pushed up from the floods. When you see gas bottle, 300 kilograms gas bottle hanging from trees 10, 14 meters high, when you see washing machines stuck in power lines, all of these are so severely shocking to your conscience that it really makes sense to not be able to operate fully in these conditions. A couple of other more pictures. So you can see on the left, and that was a picture that the Southern Cross Uni published on their website, Lismore floodwater enough to fill half of Sydney Harbour. And to be fair, while Lismore has been hit particularly hard, it's not just Lismore, it's the entire Northern Rivers that's been dramatically affected by it, a number of towns and cities which were left in dire conditions. On the right, you can see also the result of that, the amount of waste. So according to the government's flood cleanup stops 100,000 tons, which is very hard to make sense of. So another figure, 22,000 truckloads of waste removed. So you can have the sense of the impact on the sustainability and, all those critical of our societies of consumption would not sleep comfortably understanding the consequence of these figures. 13 lives were also lost, and it's a miracle, frankly, that more lives were not lost. It's incomprehensible in some ways that more lives were not lost. The number of people who were caught in a very, very distressful situation is incredibly high. And had it been for the extraordinary response effort, collective effort, we would have certainly faced additional lives lost. So as the Parliamentary Committee says, while it is unclear how many people overall were impacted by the floods, my guess would be probably 90 to 95% of the Northern Rivers. 4,055 properties were deemed uninhabitable, with a further 11,000 assessed as damaged and 8,000 inundated with water. You might have seen those pictures on the news. So the Insurance Council of Australia estimated the cost and scale of the damages to home, businesses and infrastructure of more than $5.5 billion, the largest in Australian history. And according to Munich Re, the 2022 floods in our region were the second most costliest event in the world for insurers last year. They were the fourth largest disaster in the world based on overall losses. So I hope that gives you some ideas of what unprecedented floods look like. But to delve further, it's wrong to speak just about floods, and that's why I often speak about flooding events. Because flood, when you think of flood, you think of water in the house, water in the streets. But effectively, there were thousands of people stuck in the hills who had faced landslides and landslips and roads destroyed and communities and villages isolated for weeks on end, with no way in, no way out. So landslides are a significant figure of floodings. And a number of my friends and colleagues living in the hills discovered that they could be flooded by water coming from above their house. And it not only affected communities, but affected all services, including SES, fire stations, ambulance stations, police stations, and hospitals being flooded. And you can see here the picture of the Lismore fire station. On the left at a normal level, on the right with the flood levels. And the thing is, as a firefighter, so I work also with Fire and Rescue New South Wales, a fiery. And I remember once there was an incident for which I was called out. There was a car accident. Someone veered off road, broke their leg. He was okay. And what was interesting is that for that single vehicle accident, I counted 21 emergency response vehicles. The Fire and Rescue, the Rural Fire Service, the SES, the Volunteer Rescue Association, the police, the paramedics. I was both astonished and shocked by the waste of resources. But that is what we have grown to be accustomed in Australia. We know that when we call 000, the cavalry is going to come. However, in large-scale unprecedented disasters, the cavalry cannot come because the cavalry is itself affected. And that is why the number of people affected by the floods is not just those who were affected with water or landslips. It's also those who woke up and suddenly got out in the street and their world was upside down. Suddenly people had no access to communications, no power, no internet, no food in the shop. That's a picture I took in one of the supermarkets. No cash from the ATMs. No petrol at the petrol station. No access to hospitals. No access to schools. No access to work. So their normal daily world was really transfigured. And this is enough to cause traumatic effects. So, as a colleague of mine said, it was not just a flood, it really was a humanitarian crisis. And for anyone who lives in the northern rivers here, I can tell you, we don't speak about these flooding events in the past. We speak about it very much in the present tense. It's still happening. We are still part of that flooding events. And what made the events particularly distressing is not just the impact, the sheer unprecedented scale, it was also the debacle of a response. So I know that's a poor slide, right? You never put too much text in a slide, right? I know this. However, I could not resist sharing with you some quotes from the New South Wales Parliament Select Committee on the Response on the Major Flooding across New South Wales, because they speak for themselves. The SES and Resilience New South Wales failed as lead agencies to provide adequate leadership and effective coordination during the major flooding. The New South Wales government agencies lacked coordination, created confusion, and responded poorly. The New South Wales government agency and the BOM were not prepared for, nor did they comprehend the scale of the floods, and some agencies were criticized for treating it as a 9-to-5 business operation. The SES failed in its public communication of flood warnings and evacuation information by issuing out-of-date, inaccurate, and confusing message. And to give you exactly what they are talking here, after the first flood, or just preceding the first flood, there were evacuation orders that had been made, and this particular evacuation order, so asking people to leave their house, was rescinded, was cancelled few hours before the second flood hit. So how wrong can you get that? You ask for a whole month people not to go back home, and on the day you tell them, now it's safe, now you can get home, you get flooded again. The New South Wales government agencies, telecommunication providers failed to ensure that communities affected by the floods had adequate emergency communications capabilities. Notwithstanding the role of the SES to perform rescues, individual members of the community had no other option but to ignore government advice and save lives. And here I'd like to pay my respect to those in uniforms. I have many friends working for different or volunteering for different emergency services. I know they did what they could with what they had. So it's not a blame game. It's simply an acknowledgement that the governmental system were not enough to deal with those severely disruptive events. So why that has happened? So we can think of different reasons, but according to the Floodplain Management Australia Technical Director, while many of the February and March floods were floods of records at various gauges, they were well within the realms of probability based on existing flood studies and management plans. So yes, it was unprecedented, but it wasn't a surprise either. And personally, and as part of my academic research, I see it very much to top-down climate denialism and inability to understand the practical on-the-ground consequences of the climate crisis we're in. And I published a couple of years ago, actually it's been published last year, but I submitted to the International Journal of Emergency Management an article a couple of years ago where I was arguing that emergency services were not ready for large-scale disasters because they do not comprehend the sheer scale of climate crisis and what it means. And I was kind of both angered, blown away, frustrated by the fact that how come a random guy can see this so clearly while all sorts of government structures could not? Why do we continue business as usual while we know all too well that our lifestyle is what leads to these sort of consequences? So focusing specifically on emergency management, I realized that emergency managers have also a specific way of thinking and viewing the world, which also prevents them actually to be able to face the reality of the climate crisis. And some previous researchers have shown that emergency managers generally share an outlook and mindset that may make climate change less salient for them. So what does that mean? It means that emergency management focus on extreme events and therefore are unlikely to necessarily give as much attention to the smaller events leading to those large-scale events. They have an all-hazard approach to preparing for disaster, which is very valuable, but also limited in the fact that climate change may be just one aspect to concentrate on among a long list of different risks. They also tend to concentrate on acute rather than chronic hazards, again, focusing on those really visible disruptive events as opposed to the ongoing slower one that paved the way for these disruptive events. Emergency managers are driven in their risk analysis by historical experiences of hazards and disasters. So there's been a number of research that show that when emergency personnel responds to incidents, they tend to respond in a way that have learned through their careers. They use something from the past to inform the choice they make in the crisis and the disaster. So they tend, it is also a human trait. It's very difficult to think of how different the world can be in the century of the climate crisis. It's just, our brain is not designed to think this way. It's extremely complex. And it's also very complex to turn this knowledge into practical preparedness, prevention steps. And from a research from Boshamworth in Victoria, with personnel from fire management services, she found out that emergency personnel could understand climate change, obviously, but again, they did not necessarily have the ability to understand the radical changes needed to adequately prepare for those. So it's clear overall that agencies weren't taking into consideration flood probabilities, plus a worsening climate, nor were they heeding lessons from the 2017 floods that had already affected our region. So technical knowledge existed, it just hadn't been used to its full extent. And so the community rose. It was extraordinary. Like, I have been in my previous career as an international aid worker, I've lived in many disaster and war zones. I know the power of community, but it rings differently when it's home. And it was nothing less than extraordinary. Like, people naturally, spontaneously delve into action, sprung into action, taking immense amount of risk to help strangers. And you've probably seen those images of people getting in teenies and kayak and boats and navigating various tricky currents and putting their life at risk to save others. And people building rope bridge across rivers because the bridges had been taken away by the water. Or people piloting their private helicopters to save lives and evacuate people, distribute food, distribute drugs across different isolated communities in the region. But there's also the army of volunteers that came up from the region, but all across Australia, really, that started helping in different community hubs, donating goods, receiving those goods, going through these goods, and you might have heard of the expression, the second flood, when you're overwhelmed with all the donations, and redistributing those goods to who needed them, cleaning houses by the thousands, donating money, conducting welfare checks, knocking in people's door and ensuring they were well, and providing them information about what support services they could access, etc., etc. So all across the Northern Rivers, community groups, emerged. They were forced to emerge in some ways to lead that response. Some from previously established network like Plancy or Resilient Lismore, and others just were created. And those community hubs, you can see some pictures here, like on the left, this was in Mullumbimby, in front of the Civic Center. There are some volunteers who kind of are helping people getting the help they need. On the right is Lismore, people cleaning houses. And there's been a multiplicity of community resilience hubs that have emerged, but also stayed since. The need is ongoing. And it's pretty astonishing. You have heard, obviously, of Resilient Lismore, but there's also Resilient UK, Koori Mail, the South Golden Beach, New Brighton Ocean Shores Community Resilience Team, the Maynard Discover Recovery Group, Hub 2040-84 in Murwillumbah, the Channon Resilience Hub, the Nimbin Disaster Resilience Group, etc., etc. And all of these are interconnected, and we learn from each other, and we exchange goods and volunteers and training and stuff like that. And they are still very active on the ground. They had very, very little rest in those past 12 months, and many of them are focused on recovery and helping people return to their housing, access grants, access services. Others also focus on looking forward and already preparing for the next disasters, building radio communication systems, getting in touch with the local emergency services, training locals, organizing neighborhoods, connecting residents. So it's really an ongoing work. And at Plancy, a project that we had started actually in response to the bushfires, and we were implementing, in the process of implementing previous to the flood, but we expanded constantly after the flood, is our Northern Rivers Community and Cares and Responders Network, CCR. So what we do is we train 200 people, local people, like whoever wants to join is welcome. And we make sure they undertake 5 days of training with us, 3 days on disaster recovery, self-care, which is essential, community building and disaster preparedness, 1 day on first aid, 1 day on psychological first aid. And then we nurture them. It's a network. It's not a training, it's a network. So we organize additional workshops, we organize field visits, we organize community events where they can meet on a regular basis, connect from across the northern rivers, learn from each other, share skills, help each other out, etc., etc. I have to say, I have been very critical before of the government, legitimately so, but I think it's also very legitimate to recognize the extraordinary efforts the governments at all levels have gone through after the floods. As a friend of mine has said, the train was late to leave the station, but now it's at full speed. The government train was very late indeed, but it's pretty astonishing what it has accomplished in the past year. So I've mentioned one inquiry before, but there was also another inquiry, and echoing the comments from Mark earlier, and the list of, extraordinary actions that the governments, from Commonwealth to state to local have been doing. I'm so grateful to live in our democracy. I'm so grateful to live in a country where we have such amazing good governance, despite everything, despite red tape, despite everything, If you read those inquiries, it's astonishing that we can make those sort of criticism publicly, and some people listen and take action and learn from that. We don't live in autocratic regimes. We don't live in a dictatorship. We live where people can be accountable at times. So the Australian and New South Wales governments have committed more than $3.5 billion to support the recovery, repair and rebuilding of impacted communities. And this includes the establishment of the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Authority with an $800 million Resilient Homes Fund to pay for buybacks, raising houses, retrofitting them. And this is the largest resilience response of its kind in Australian history. The provision of large amount of diverse grants to individuals, not-for-profit organizations, and businesses, including $165 million grant for under the Northern Rivers Business Support Package. All of these have issues. All of these are too slow, etc., but they exist. And for instance, one of the grants that we have received at Plancy is from the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. And frankly, we were blown away. Like, for anyone writing grant here, I'm sure most of you in the room know the painful process that it is. In this particular case, it was literally a 2-page. We did not even have to submit a budget. We just said, look, this is what we're doing. We'd like to do more of it. Will you fund us? Yeah, here it is, $200,000. Just like that. And now we send monthly reports. It takes me around 15 minutes to write those reports every month. So some layers of government understand it, get it. They understand the gravity of the crisis we're in. They've learned and implemented new processes. They've lowered the risk, the acceptance of the risk, and they accepted that, we're going to give this money, disburse this money quickly, understanding we may lose some in the process, but we agree to take that risk. The government also established a network of recovery support officers and resilience officers at council level and local level. They have established safe havens at local level for anyone to pop in and receive some immediate psychological support and be directed to mental health services. They have launched the Northern Rivers Resilience Initiative, undertaken by the newly created National Emergency Management Agency and CSIRO to understand climate, catchment, and hydrological drivers within our region. And as we know, Resilience New South Wales has been wound down with the establishment of yet another new agency, the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. And these are just examples. But the point is, it's critically important, I think, to accept, to see the limitations of our governments, but also honor what they have done and to be able to hold both in our hands so that we don't fall prey to idealism or blame game. We really need to do it together. We need to be frank about what works and what doesn't work, and have this open conversation and non-judgmental ways of looking at someone's work is, I think, part of that. But challenges remain, obviously. So on the one hand, the train has left the station, and it's the sort of changes I've just listed before are pretty astonishing when you think of how slow government moves usually. So it's been very fast, but if you're still living in the street because your house was flooded and you have no certainty about whether you should return it, clean it, raise it, move, relocate, etc., it's too slow. So thousands of locals remain in severe housing stress, and just last week, A colleague mentioned that she has moved into her 40th 40 place this year. Communities' mental health remains severely affected and referral pathway remains unsatisfying. That was my timing to tell me I need to accelerate a little bit. There's been a delayed recovery implementation. So while there's been a lot of resources poured into the region, they arrived quite late. And for instance, caseworkers have came on board much later than people would have needed it. There's massive recruitment issues. There's a lot of jobs that remain unfilled. Stories of social disintegration abound. So increase of domestic violence, increase in acts of criminality, increase in substance abuse, increase in suicide. And I'm really sad to say that probably most Northern Rivers residents know of some people in those situations. So while institutions and emergency agencies agree that communities have a role in the disaster management, this role is not clear. If you look at the Bushfire Royal Commission report, there's a quote, and I'm not going to say it exactly, but the idea is the emergency service agencies do not have and will never have the capacity to respond to the needs of every individual. In other words, we can't have a fire truck in front of every house. So that was kind of an essential learning from the bushfires that remained a bit theoretical in some places, but it became so real in the floods, where people would not see any emergency service for days. So what has happened is the recognition of community. It was community was everywhere. So clearly there was an acknowledgement of the role of community. What remains unclear is how can the institutions, including but not limited to the emergency management agencies and communities, better work together? How can we have more of a whole of a community approach? And as we'll explore shortly, what's the role in business also in that relationship? Also, like if you think of it, they are essentially relocating a good part of a large city, Lismore, uphill. And while the buybacks, the retrofitting, the relocations, etc., are essential, there's no vision. There's no really community conversations. There's no inspiring way of looking forward. Who are we? Where are we? What will we become once we move out from this place? So it's very technocratic, unfortunately, and at the same time, people's headspace and the fatigue is such that's actually difficult to engage with these, big conversations. Communities are consulted, so there's a lot of good, lots of good consultations of communities, but they are not leading the changes either because they don't have the capacity, because of the sheer exhaustion, or because of the technocratic processes, which makes the train go fast and not stopping really to make sure it listens to their passengers' perspectives. And although there's heaps of new... Oh, that's okay, I'll just continue if you don't mind. Although there's heaps of new services, medical, mental health, and other services that have popped up after the floods, even for someone like me who's reasonably well versed in this topic, I struggle to actually make sense of all of these. There are just so many. So I can imagine someone who's severely affected from a mental health perspective would find this very intimidating to even ask help. They would not know where to start. There's also uncertainty about community funding. So, while I'm really grateful for the funding that we have received and other community groups, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's next. And for now, there doesn't seem to be much next. So kind of, okay, so what happened in 3 months' time and 6 months' time and 9 months' time when the funding ends? Recovery is a multi-year journey. Also, something which is well worth noting is a community fatigue, and I'm so glad it's one of today's topic because it's really something that needs to be explored. And when I say here, community is not just residents. It's also emergency management personnel. It's also council staff. It's really anyone living and responding to these large-scale unprecedented disasters. We are all exhausted. And on the right, you can see a diagram which was published a couple of decades ago, so it's a bit old but still relevant, that shows the phases of disaster, which we use a lot in our training and workshops. And you can see on the left the impact. This is when the flooding happens. And then there's a rise in the response, and then there's a fall in the response. From an emotional perspective, people are different space in that journey. However, as we have seen last week with the anniversary of the flood, a lot of people are still here, still falling. They haven't reached the ground yet. They haven't bounced back. So, with this in mind, how can governments at all levels, like Commonwealth, state, local, support community resilience? I think one is create a regulatory framework and provide resources to help community help itself. Research shows, whether it's an earthquake in Japan, a monsoon in Vietnam, or else, it's always the community that is the first responder, because it takes a few days for the agencies to scale up to the level it is needed. So let's acknowledge this, and let's equip communities truly to make sure they can do that. They can be trained, they can be safe, but in a way which does not prevent them to do it. So if we start bringing in red tape in the process, it's not going to work. Government needs to support council in having full-time and ongoing resilience officers. All these new positions I mentioned before are just temporary for the time being. It needs to lead campaigns to raise awareness about risks and ways to build resilient housing, energy, resilient communications, food and water system, health system. It needs to support community resilience building training and systems like apps and different social media that could be used in the process, as well as provide online geo-specific risk analysis tool for anyone to understand really what at risk to their particular house or property. It needs to improve food security. When it comes to disaster, we think a lot of bushfires and water, but we don't think necessarily a lot about the implications of this when there is a bushfire or flood. And for someone who's not versed at all in these topics, what they experience in addition to disaster is the severe disruption to their way of life, the limited access to food, the limited access to water, the limited access to communications, energy, etc. We need to also promote the use of waste in closed loops, ensure community-owned local energy systems. So if there's a power outage, because the bushfire down south, it doesn't affect communities up north. Support community building project, including artists. I'm really glad to see this exhibition here because it's really part of us making sense of what's happening to us collectively. Genuinely engage in collaborative processes rather than consult. Pre-plan responses to waste in emergencies, so having a sense next time that we have to get rid, because it's going to happen again, of all of our goods, can we do that a bit more intelligently? Scale up place-based planning that incorporates diverse perspectives, community groups, and consideration of risk. And as we've mentioned before, there's no how do you say in English? Cookie cutter approach? Is that the expression? It's not one size fits all. So we really need to have a localized conversation about what would work up in the hill, what would work down in the floodplain, what would work, by the ocean, etc., etc. And create opportunities for long-term grants for community connection and recovery. So 1-year grant is fantastic. A 3 years or 5 years grants would be better. Nurture a sense of belonging, and also nurture a sense of caring for each other. Again, I'm coming back to this. Connection and kindness is in the new black. So in this process, businesses have also an essential role. As we have seen, they are providers of food, of transport, of cash, of water, of fuel, of communications, of electricity. Without business, societies does not function. So the triple bottom line, people, profit, prosperity, I think, saves life. I can tell you multiple stories where it's thanks to businesses that communities were saved. For instance, through allowing people to use their space as a community hub, or allowing to use their resources for free. And business owners and employers were, extremely active, not just in their recovery, but in that of others, within the streets, within the neighborhoods. The generosity that businesses have shown was to the roof. You would literally, call someone and say, hey, I'm part of this flood response in this town. We need this. Can you help us? Yeah, no worries. We'll send a truckload of it. No, we just need to. No, you'll get a truckload. Okay. And the next day we'd receive a truckload of whatever it is that we asked for. So really businesses play a key role, and research has shown that the quicker businesses recover from disaster, the quicker the community recovers and falls back to a sense of normalcy. But businesses are also victims of disasters. So in order for this role to be effective, they too have to prepare and build their own resilience. That means they have to have solid business continuity plans. And the things to think of is all the many aspects of a business that can break down: supply chains, obviously, communications, power, cash, human resources with people unable to come to work, etc., IT systems, but also reputational risks associated to not being able to respond or respond well enough. That means that in order to be prepared, businesses need to build redundancies in their systems, check their insurance coverage and exclusion. But also, and I know it's hard, especially if you have a small business, dedicate time, and time is money, as we know, but dedicate time to build connections and resources. A cornerstone of resilience is collaboration. And from a business perspective, I think something which may be helpful and hopefully transformative is to see those disasters not just as challenges to be prepared for and be afraid of, but as opportunities to change the business models. So I've been inspired by the work of Benet and Al that I published a few years ago, and in a nutshell, you can see here 3 different kind of columns across the resilience spectrum. So resilience, is a term that comes from engineering studies back in the days, and it meant that the capacity of material to be bent without breaking, and hence the expression bouncing back to normal. So this kind of bouncing back is really the common understanding of resilience, but it's very limiting. If you think of bouncing forward in changing in the process of bouncing, you can sense that it holds other promises of adaptability and not just resistance. So on the left, you can see that if you have an organization, a community, a business, you can choose and prepare for a simple absorptive coping capacity. Just cope, cross your fingers and hope everything will be fine. Second way is to adapt to it. So you build your system that, whatever happens, yes, there'll be disruptions, but you adapt to it. And third one is a transformative capacity. And I think this is what we need to do. It's not talk about just resilience, but really regeneration. We need to regenerate our food systems, regenerate our water systems, regenerate our health, our education, our communities, and more. So practically, what does it look like? So I've provided here some examples. If you start on the left with the businesses, bottom left. So if you look simply at absorptive capacity, in times of communication disruptions, that means that, you just maintain the communication somehow. You hope that they won't be broken down. You may have phone and internet. But if you look at it from an adaptive capacity, you kind of plan for this and build redundancy in your communication, which means you have multiple ways to access internet and multiple ways to access phone calls. But if you look at it from a transformative perspective, then you really rethink the business model. And if you, a company like whatever, Bunnings or stuff like that, you don't just ensure good communications, but you really provide decision-making at local level, so that it doesn't rely on a whole host of systems for communication to pass up and down. If you look at resilient projects, whether you're a charity or a council, a business, you can, for instance, stop activities temporarily while the crisis is happening. Or you can develop this ability to continue working and use this as a way to reinforce your project. Or you can simply work completely differently with different partners, with different location. So you incorporate the risks into the model that makes you work, if that makes sense. If you look at communities, from a simply absorptive capacities, you help communities build their food stock. From a more adaptive capacity, you help them access different food providers when crisis happens. And from a transformative capacity, you ensure that they have food themselves. So you can sense that, you can be creative and see resilience, not just as a challenge, not just as something we need to reluctantly prepare for, but as an opportunity to improve. So to conclude with, I'd like to insist on the fact that, especially, I guess, as a foreigner, something that struck me arriving to Australia 8 years ago was the focus on planning. Planning. Yes, planning is essential, and we need to have all sorts of crisis plan, business continuity plans, etc. But I would argue as essential, or if not more essential, is emotional intelligence, is the capacity to assess what is happening and adapt as things unfold, to read the environment, rely on connections, to respond to what is. So it is a shift in mindset, and it's letting go also of some sort of risk management template that is a bit rigid in the way they shape our responses. A second aspect is nurturing your networks and value collaboration. What we have seen, in these times of unprecedented disasters is suddenly you fall back into previous existing networks. You reconnect with people you barely knew or people you were friends with 5 years ago, whatever. And these become the cornerstone of the response. This is the cornerstone of the support, in many shape and form. So investing in relationship is well worth the time and effort. And finally, and coming back to what I was saying in my when I started this presentation, it's just so important we are kind to ourselves. We are really going through unprecedented times, and I'm pretty sure none of us here in the room actually really understand what's going on to us. What we're looking at, we are really facing the barrel of the gun, and if you start thinking of how our society is going to look like in 10, 30 years' time, it will look severely different. And none of us really understand this, but it's dramatic. So it's important to let go of pressures that we put on each other, on pressure that we put on ourselves, and acknowledge our ignorance. Acknowledge that we're making it up as we go, so that we can better learn and reinforce each other. So with this, I don't know you, but I could really do with some precedented times for a change. Thank you.